So stepping forward then like 200 years or something to England's first queen, Regnant, is what you're talking about at TudorCon this year. And there's a big debate. It's so funny because whenever I tell somebody I'm into Tudor history, they always say, well, what do you think about, does Lady Jane Grey count? Is she Jane the First? Because there was Edward the Fifth wasn't, I always say, well, she wasn't crowned. Well, neither was Edward the Fifth, right? So, but I don't want to get into too many of the arguments because that is for you to make. But I think this is one of those questions anybody who's into Tudor history has thought about at least a little bit, is like, was Jane really the first queen? I don't know. Should she get credit for that? Um, so tell me, that's what you're going to be talking about this year. So tell me like some of the arguments pro, and then we'll do the arguments against to start with. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So pro is that Edward VI, when he knew he was dying, made his will and he named her as his heir. So he's the king. The king can pretty much do what he wants and name his own heir. So that gives it some leverage. The other thing is, a lot of the nobles originally did support her claim. It was only for 9 or 13 days, depending on who you ask. But she did have the support of a lot of the nobility. Um, she was a descendant of Henry VII, but through an indirect way. And she was a little mature enough age. Edward VI was reigning pretty much on his own at 15, and she was 16. So she had a decent claim. If that's who Edward wanted as his heir, that's who he chose. Um, as far as against, well, Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII, so she's the daughter of a king, whereas Jane was the great granddaughter of a king. So she was Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister's granddaughter. And another strange thing is how Jane's mother, Frances Brandon, was just skipped over. She was still alive when Edward VI died, but he didn't name her as his heir. He named Frances Brandon's children as his heirs. And it's kind of shady as to why he did that. So that would be a thing against it, is why was she skipped over? But then you could make the argument, why was Margaret Beaufort skipped over, and Henry Tudor claimed the crown, or why was Elizabeth of York skipped over? So you can draw a lot of parallels. Um,
So I
well,
have a
for Jane,
question. Oh, can I just interrupt? I have a
oh
question just
yeah,
about what the will actually said. Because didn't it initially say heirs of her body, male heirs of her body, but then change that? Tell me about that.
you're right. So initially it did say the male heirs of her body. I think at first Edward thought that he probably had more time to live, and so he wanted to get Jane married off and assumed that she would have children pretty soon, and that by the time he died, she would actually have male heirs. And of course, the misogyny of the Tudors comes in, where we have to have a male. So that was the original idea, and I think that might be a reason why Frances Brandon was skipped over, is because the woman. Um, but it seems like once the situation got more dire and it was clear that Edward was going to die, he just said, "Okay, fine, we'll make it Jane, and then the heirs of her body." So she was in a way kind of a placeholder, just because she had the potential to bear children, whereas her mother was probably past childbearing age.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Carry on if I haven't disturbed or disrupted your train of thought too much. We were
Oh,
talking about
not at all, not
potential
at all.
cons. Okay. All right.
It's interesting because there really is an argument for both sides, and then it comes down to, like you mentioned, but if they're crowned or not, does that count? Because then we can look at Empress Matilda. She technically had a claim also to be queen way back in the 12th century, but she was never crowned, and she didn't actually call herself queen. She called herself Lady of the English. And so when her cousin usurped the throne, he was crowned and he counts. So Matilda is debated, but most people agree she wasn't the first queen. She never had any power, whereas Jane did. She was actually at court and she was actually signing documents, and supported by the nobility for a few days at least. So it seems like there's more of an argument for Jane than Matilda. But as far as the cons against Jane's claim, she herself didn't want to be queen, and she herself actually said Mary is the rightful queen, which is remarkable because she was staunchly Protestant and Mary was staunchly Catholic. And so you would think that she would, support her own claim or at least the claim of someone who had the same religious views as her. But even she had to admit that, it was Mary's throne. And here Mary is, she's the granddaughter of Isabella of Castile. She's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the world's first female ambassador. And she's Henry VIII's daughter. And even though he never legitimized her, I think that still held some way in people's minds that, Henry VIII, when we picture him in his Holbein picture, like that's still his daughter, and also she never renounced her claim. Yeah, he called her illegitimate, and at one point he said she didn't have a claim, but she never let go of that. And Catherine of Aragon never did. So it's one of those things where it really depends on who you ask, you know. So he said she didn't have a claim, but then he went back on it. She stood fast. And another thing is that she didn't leave England, when, the coup was made for Jane Grey to take the throne. If you look at other kings when they're in trouble, like James II or, even Edward IV, like, they take off for France, and she had that option. She was given basically a safe conduct by her cousin, the emperor, to go to Spain or go to France, somewhere safe and just get out of England, and she didn't. Like, she made the choice on her own to stick with her guns and be the queen. She really felt that it was her rightful place, whereas Jane didn't even she just didn't have the motivation. Her heart wasn't in it, it doesn't seem.
Right. So let me actually back up. I realize we started getting into the debate, and I should have asked what Edward's motivation was, and then the reasoning behind, like, you know, having a Protestant, and like if he would skip over Mary, then why didn't he choose Elizabeth? Like, tell me a little bit about what the thought process was in why he created this. What was it called? His device or something like so
Yeah, the,
succession.
device for the succession. Yeah.
Right. So tell me a little bit about kind of what was in his thought as he created that. He was sick at the time and like what he was thinking about that got even any of this started in the first place. Because up until that device, it was just going to be Mary next, and then he changed it. So why?
I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think he was heavily influenced. He was 15, and he had just been around a small circle of nobles, and it was really Jane Grey's father, Henry Grey, who was the Duke of Suffolk, and then Guilford Dudley, her husband's father, who was the Duke of Northumberland. They were in Edward's inner circle, and they seemed to really push him, to name her his heir. And I think they kind of pushed the prospect that, she was, like-minded, like him. They were relatively the same age, that she had the potential to have children. So I think somehow they were able to persuade him to choose Jane over Elizabeth, because you're right, it doesn't make sense why he wouldn't choose Elizabeth because she was Protestant. But then again, that is a huge double standard. If Mary and Elizabeth were both,
Both
um,
illegitimate.
illegitimate, then how can you make one sister legitimate and not the other? So I guess he felt like it was an all or nothing situation, but I feel like that all or nothing view was really pushed on him by, Jane's father-in-law and her father,
Yeah.
so that they could essentially have a puppet queen on the throne.
Yeah. So those Dudleys are always messing everything up, aren't they? Dudleys. Like
Same
you'd think they'd
family, same
learn after a couple.
family.
you'd think they would catch on that their scheming doesn't never seems to work, but maybe each generation thinks, "Oh, I'll be the one that doesn't get put to death," or I don't know. Anyway, um, so here's my question. How much so how much did Jane actually want this? You mentioned her reluctance. Like, what and not even that, but, like, what was her, to use a modern word, which I don't always like to do, but, like, her agency with it? Like, did she because then it got a little tricky for them a couple of days in when they realized that she wasn't gonna be the puppet that they thought she was, right? Talk to me a little bit about kind of, like, what her thinking about it was once it was thrust upon her. How did she handle it? What it w tell me about that.
Well, as I said, yes, she was very reluctant at first to accept it. But once she saw that they meant business and that she might actually have a chance, and they didn't know if Mary was going to flee or stand and fight, she did kind of double down and tell her father and father-in-law, "Well, no, I am the queen, and I'm not going to be your puppet." And so, in the last few days, she did start to feel that it was God's will that she was chosen to be England's queen for whatever reason, so she was reluctant, but basically she took on the attitude of, okay, well, if this is going to be forced upon me, I'm going to make the best of it and become a Protestant champion. She was so zealous that she felt maybe even some of the reforms that Edward had put in place didn't go far enough. Um, so she did kind of shift and accept it
Mhm.
toward the last few days.
Yeah. Huh. That would have what a weird little alternate history if she had survived and we would have no choir books left and no stained glass windows and no paintings at all.
Yep.
Because if she would have gone even further, my goodness, didn't know it was possible to go further than what Edward did.
And you
Uh,
could argue, and this is completely conjecture, we have no proof of it, but, Mary is known as Bloody Mary because of the Protestants that she burned. But
mhm.
who's to say that, if Jane had continued on the same path, that she wouldn't have burned 300 Catholics as well? There's an argument there for that, I think, just because they were both um, very pious, very, very zealous in their religious beliefs, both Mary and Jane.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
could be Bloody Jane.
Right. Right. Imagine that as a drink. Um, Interesting. Okay, so I'm not gonna ask you whose side you fall on because you'll reveal that in your talk, I'm sure. But the pros and the cons for whether or not she's the first queen, um, yeah, I'm not sure where I stand on it either. It does seem like she had she had all the trappings of a queen. She just wasn't crowned, but neither was Edward V, and we didn't go from Edward IV to Edward VI. He's still
Right,
considered Edward V, even though
exactly.
he surely had even less power than Jane did.
Yep.
He yeah.
Yeah, and the way, Henry IV came to the throne, I mean, he was crowned, but he still basically just stood up in Parliament and said, "Yeah, I'm king now," and everyone just said, "Okay," and
Mhm.
no one argued, so that there was a precedence for someone just coming in and saying, "Yeah, okay, I think I'm gonna be the monarch now." And if
Yeah.
people accept that, going through with that, the key is that, yeah, she didn't make it to her coronation, but, yeah, I think there's an argument for that too.
Yeah. Huh. Um, I always just think of her as this I always feel sorry for her when I think about her because I just always think she's this poor girl who didn't want any of this, and it was just thrust on her and those terrible Dudleys, and, they're awful and everything like that. Um, is that how you would see her too, or is there something that I'm missing when I think of her that way?
I do feel sorry for her, in some ways because she was 16. She was very well educated. She was very intelligent. It said that she spoke eight languages. She read Plato for enjoyment. She was just very bright. So I think she did have some agency, but she was still 16. And we know these days that your whole brain doesn't fully become adult and your prefrontal cortex isn't done developing until you're 25. So,
Right.
um, I think, in some ways she was pushed and the throne was thrust upon her by her father and her mother and her
Mhm.
father-in-law. Um, so I think yeah, I think in some ways I do feel sorry for her, but also she knew the risks and she could have absolutely refused and just not gone along with their game, but she did. She convinced
Mhm.
herself at least that it was
Yeah.
God's will that she was to be queen.
And then tell me a little bit about after Mary became queen, because it wasn't just a thing where Mary's like, "All right, I'm queen, you're all dead now." And this is where, like, I think her father, like, honestly, what was he even thinking? Like, I don't think people thought through consequences. Like, I see these bad decisions, and I'm just like, "Were you thinking about this at all? Were you thinking about your daughter in the tower when you what was the what where was this gonna go? What was gonna be the game plan here? So tell me about the time when she was in the tower before she was killed and kind of like what can we and this is a surprise question I'm just throwing at you here, but it just hit me. What can we kind of learn about her character or who she was when she was in that situation?
Well, I like that you pointed out that Mary didn't just say off with their heads right away, because she didn't. She pardoned Jane. She said that she was young, she was, influenced, and she gave her credit for that. She didn't kill her cousin, Jane's mother, Frances. So I like that, Mary gets that credit because you always hear, "Oh, and then she killed Jane." Well, she waited a year, and the reason why is because there was a rebellion in favor of putting Jane back on the throne, so at that point, she kinda had to. Um, but it seems like Jane, and to me at least, it feels like she just kind of welcomed it, just kind of like, "Oh, goodness," like, Mary wanted the throne, I don't have to do this, like, okay. I think she even despite her zeal for the Protestant faith, I think she still saw it as, okay, well, this is God's will, that for whatever reason, Mary's gonna be queen, and thank goodness.